In the spring of 1944, more than 6,000 Allied aircraft used this runway in a single year. Crippled bombers shot up over France, limped back across the Channel, and found safety here. Spitfires, Typhoons, American B-17s with their engines on fire. The runway at Manston in the Isle of Thanet on the Kent coast was 9,000 feet long and 750 feet wide, the largest emergency landing strip in Britain. It was built to save lives, and it did. 80 years later, that same runway sits empty. The terminal building is shuttered. The car parks are growing moss, and a series of businessmen, politicians, regulators, and property developers have collectively managed to spend, or promised to spend, the better part of £400 million on a commercial airport that has never, not once, turned a profit. 4 owners, 3 collapses, 2 judicial reviews, 1 runway, and 0 viable airlines. This is the story of Manston Airport, and it tells you something rather important about how Britain decides where to spend its money, who gets to make those decisions, and what happens when nobody is ever held properly accountable for getting it spectacularly, expensively wrong. Chapter 1. The Camp That Saved Britain. To understand what went wrong at Manston, you first need to understand what Manston was. The airfield opened in 1916 as a Royal Naval Air Service station. The first aircraft to land there were defending the Thames estuary against German Zeppelin raids. By the Second World War, it had grown into something indispensable. When the Dunkirk evacuation began in May 1940, Manston was one of the closest airfields to the French coast. Fighter squadrons flew from here into the chaos above the beaches. During the Battle of Britain that summer, Manston was hit so badly by Luftwaffe bombers, repeatedly, from the 12th of August 1940, that it was at one point downgraded to an emergency landing ground only. Its runways cratered, its communications destroyed. It was back in action within days. The people who worked there simply refused to let it die. By 1944, the RAF had built that extraordinary emergency runway, 9,000 feet of concrete, 750 feet wide, with 1,500-foot grass overruns at each end. It was one of only 3 master emergency diversion airfields in Britain. On the night of the 28th of August 1942 alone, 56 damaged aircraft made emergency landings here in a single night. The Barnes-Wallis bouncing bomb, used against the Ruhr dams in Operation Chastise, was trialled over the nearby Reculver range, with the Lancasters taking off from Manston itself. After the war, the Americans used it as a strategic air command base from 1950. The RAF stayed until 1999. For most of the 20th century, Manston was the sort of place where history happened. It had begun welcoming civilian flights as early as 1989, when it was rebranded Kent International Airport, a rather optimistic title for a field in Ramsgate. Holidaymakers flew to Crete, Cyprus, Spain. Concorde made a visit in 1992. For a certain generation of East Kent families, Manston was their gateway to the world. A short drive from Margate or Canterbury, none of the Gatwick chaos, a proper little airport that felt like it belonged to them. But in 1993, the government issued a report concluding that Manston was unsuitable for development into a major airport, primarily due to its proximity to the town of Ramsgate. The end of the runway was less than a mile from residential streets, and when the Ministry of Defence finally decided to pull out in 1999, selling the freehold for £4,750,000 to a property company called the Wiggins Group. And from that moment on, the clock started ticking. The RAF was gone. The Americans were gone. The wartime purpose was gone. What remained was a very large runway, a modest terminal, and the stubborn conviction shared by every owner who followed that Manston could be turned into something commercial, something viable, something profitable. Every single one of them was wrong. Chapter 2. Planet Station and the Low-Cost Aviation Bet. In 2003, the British government published a white paper called The Future of Air Transport. It stated, in the careful language of civil servants who are trying to be encouraging without making any promises, that Manston, quote, could play a valuable role in meeting local demand and could contribute to regional economic development. The government would support development in principle, subject to relevant environmental considerations. That was all the encouragement Wiggins needed. The company, which had renamed itself Plane Station Group, had watched Ryanair and EasyJet transform British aviation in the 90s. Budget airlines were everywhere. Regional airports were booming. Surely Manston, sitting 47 miles from the centre of London and just across the channel from the continent, could muscle in on that boom. In May 2004, PlaneStation bought a 30% stake in an Irish low-cost carrier called EUJet. By January 2005, it owned the whole thing, a full takeover. EUJet had already launched scheduled flights from Manston in September 2004, Fokker 100 jets, low fares, 26 routes across the UK and Europe. Edinburgh, Dublin, Murcia, Palma, Faro, Geneva. The car parks were expanded. A direct coach service ran from Bluewater Shopping Centre through Chatham. The dream at that moment looked almost real. But the dream had a fundamental problem. PlaneStation had borrowed heavily to acquire EUJet. Its debts were significant. And the passengers simply were not coming in the numbers required. Manston's catchment area in East Kent was too small. The roads from London were slow. The competition from Gatwick, Stansted and even Southend was fierce. By the second half of 2004, EUJet had recorded losses of £6.5 million. It had carried 330,000 passengers in its first year, against a projection of 500,000. The gap between ambition and reality was 34%. On the 25th of July 2005, trading in PlaneStation shares was suspended on the stock market. Negotiations with its banks, who had secured their position on property assets, had failed. An administrator was appointed. In the Republic of Ireland, an examiner was appointed to EUJet. On the 26th of July 2005, all EUJet flights were suspended. Up to 5,000 passengers were stranded abroad. 500 jobs were at risk. London Manston Airport plc went into liquidation. By July 2005, EUJet had carried approximately 300,000 passengers in total. The target had been 750,000 passengers per year, not per month, per year, and they hadn't even come close. The logic had seemed reasonable enough in 2003. Low-cost aviation was the future. Regional airports were the future. Manston had that extraordinary runway, that channel proximity, that government white paper that practically told them to get on with it. PlaneStation's management were not fools. They were optimists operating in an industry that rewards optimism right up until it doesn't. And it worked, until it stopped working. Quite suddenly, on a Tuesday in July, with 5,000 people waiting in Spanish airports for flights home that would never come. Chapter 3. 4 owners, no profit. The collapse of PlaneStation and EUJet in July 2005 did not kill Manston. It merely handed it to the next set of optimists. Domino 1. Infratil buys the dream for £17 million. On the 26th of August 2005, exactly 1 month after the collapse, a New Zealand-listed infrastructure fund called Infratil acquired Manston from the administrator for £17 million. Infratil also owned Prestwick Airport in Scotland. It had experience. It had capital. It had, critically, a master plan. That master plan, published in October 2008, stated that Manston would be handling 1,200,000 passengers within 2 years. For context, in its best year under Infratil, the airport handled considerably fewer. The freight operation, which Infratil had also pinned its hopes on, reached a peak of 31,000 tons in 2012. They had forecast 45,000 tons by 2009. In its best year, Manston handled 1.29% of the United Kingdom's total air freight tonnage. It was, in the words of parliamentary evidence submitted to a later inquiry, always very much a minnow in the freight pond. In each year that Infratil owned Manston, the airport lost more than £3 million. Every year, without exception. By the time Infratil gave up, it had written off the entire £17 million purchase price and then some. Nobody wanted the airport, and yet nobody could bring themselves to say so. Domino 2. Flybe arrives. Flybe departs. Nobody is surprised. In February 2010, Flybe launched scheduled services from Manston to Edinburgh, Belfast and Manchester. The announcement was treated locally as salvation, real airlines, daily services, the first scheduled routes since EUJet's collapse 5 years earlier. Manston was back. In November 2011, Flybe pulled out entirely, citing, and this is their actual explanation, which should be read slowly, barely any passengers. Flybe described Manston as one of the airports with the smaller catchment areas in the UK. That was the polite version. The reality was that flying from Manston to Edinburgh, more local people went to spend money in Scotland than Scots came to spend money in East Kent. Manston was not generating tourism. It was exporting it. Nobody wanted the airport, and yet nobody could bring themselves to say so. Domino 3. KLM arrives. KLM departs. Everyone pretends to be shocked. In April 2013, KLM, the Dutch national carrier, began 2 daily return flights from Manston to Amsterdam Schiphol. This was by any measure the most credible route Manston had ever hosted. Schiphol is one of the world's great hub airports. Connect to Schiphol, and you connect to everywhere. The flights were popular. In fact, in the final year of operation, more passengers started their journey at Manston than at Schiphol. Locals loved it. The load factors were reasonable. There was genuine enthusiasm. But in October 2013, 6 months after KLM's first flight, Infratil sold Manston to Anne Gloag, co-founder of the stagecoach transport empire, for £1. Not £1 million. £1. KLM's managing director, Boet Krijken, told Air Transport World magazine what he thought of the new ownership situation. The quote is short: "It does not require embellishment. Now it is game over. We will redeploy the aircraft. We are gone." KLM's last scheduled flight from Manston departed on the 9th of April 2014. Nobody wanted the airport, and yet nobody could bring themselves to say so. Domino 4. Anne Gloag closes it and rejects the buyers who could have kept it open. Anne Gloag had promised to invest, to give the airport 2 years, to turn things around. Within 4 months of taking over, she had announced a consultation on closure. The airport was losing £10,000 a day, roughly £3,650,000 per year. On the 15th of May 2014, Manston Airport closed, with the loss of 144 jobs. Here is the part that still causes genuine anger in Kent. Before the closure, a US firm called River had offered £7 million for the site. Enough, with Gloag leaving £2 million in the bank account, to give any new buyer a net £5 million from day one. The offer was refused. A second unnamed buyer also expressed interest. That offer also fell through, or was rejected, depending on whom you ask. The Unite Union's regional officer, Ian McCullough, called it a bizarre decision. Nobody wanted the airport, and yet nobody could bring themselves to say so. By the time the dust settled, the Kent County Council had commissioned its own assessment. The conclusion: across 16 years of private ownership, Wiggins, Plain Station, Infratel, and Anne Gloag's company, Manston Airport, had accumulated losses exceeding £100 million. £100 million. The airport had never in any year of its commercial life turned a profit. Chapter 4. Why no one could get out. The question people ask, the obvious question, the one that any reasonable person would ask within 5 minutes of looking at the figures, is why did anyone keep trying? The answer requires understanding something structural about the aviation industry that is not immediately obvious if you are not in it. Think of running an airport as running a pub. You can have the finest beer garden in the county. You can have lovely staff, good parking, a decent kitchen. But if you are located at the end of a winding B road, 12 miles from the nearest train station, with 3 other pubs within easy reach of anyone with a car, you are not going to win. The product is not the problem. The geography is the problem. And you cannot move a pub. Manston had exactly this problem, multiplied across 2 distinct market failures. The first was passenger catchment. The Isle of Thanet, Ramsgate, Margate, Broadstairs has a combined population of around 130,000 people. Even drawing from Canterbury and the surrounding area, the realistic catchment for a regional airport is modest. For comparison, Gatwick serves a catchment measured in the tens of millions. Every airline that tried Manston eventually reached the same conclusion. The passengers who live close enough to use it conveniently are simply not numerous enough to fill planes profitably. Parliamentary evidence showed that KLM's average load factor on its Manston Schiphol route in the year before it closed was below 44.4%. You need somewhere above 75 to 80% to make the numbers work. At 44%, you are hemorrhaging money on every flight. The second was freight. Every owner, Wiggins, Infratil, River has pointed at Manston's location near the Channel Tunnel and the Kent ports and argued it is a natural freight hub. In 2005, Infratil forecast Manston would handle 45,000 tons of freight per year by 2009. The peak in 2012 was 31,000 tons. That sounds substantial until you learn it. Represented 1.29% of the UK's total air freight market. Manston was 7th among British freight airports in its best year. But here is the structural trap that nobody acknowledged publicly, even when they surely understood it privately. Every new owner arrived with a business plan that required significant external investment to succeed. Airlines needed inducements to start routes. Infrastructure needed upgrading. The runway, extraordinary as it is, needed maintenance. In 2011, Infratil and Kent County Council actually approached the national government seeking a £600,000 subsidy to underwrite the cost of attracting a single unnamed airline to launch a new route. Taxpayer money requested to reduce the risk for an airline to fly to an airport that had already demonstrated, repeatedly, that passengers did not come in sufficient numbers. The request was unsuccessful. Meanwhile, Gatwick was growing. Heathrow was operating at full capacity and generating enormous political pressure for expansion. Stansted was handling 15 million passengers a year. Even London Southend, considerably closer to London than Manston, was investing seriously in its terminal and attracting EasyJet. Every pound spent at those airports was a pound not spent at Manston. Every slot filled at Gatwick was a route decision that removed Manston from consideration. The competition was not abstract market forces. It was specific airports with specific investment, specific connectivity, and specific track records. And yet, the runway was still there. The Battle of Britain history was still there. And so each new owner told themselves the same story. The previous owners had simply done it wrong. This time would be different. It was not different. Chapter 5, River Oak, the Courts and the Never-Ending Saga. After Anne Glow closed Manston in May 2014, she sold the majority stake later that year to commercial property developers Trevor Cartner and Chris Musgrave, who rebranded the site as Stonehill Park and unveiled plans for 2,500 homes, a sports village, manufacturing units, and a film studio to rival Pinewood. 4,000 jobs, they promised. Local MP for Thanet North, Sir Roger Gale, described it as sounding remarkably like opportunist land banking. He was not the only one thinking it. The original River Oak Corporation, the US firm whose £7 million bid had been rejected in May 2014, had not given up. By 2016, a British entity called River Oak Strategic Partners, or RSP, had been formed, with Tony Freudman, who, in one of those facts that feels almost too neat, had been operations director at the Wiggins Group back in the early 2000s, as its director. In 2019, RSP purchased the Manston site for £16,500,000. It submitted an application for a development consent order, the planning mechanism used for nationally significant infrastructure projects to convert the site into an international air freight hub. This was, as RSP's press release carefully noted, the first DCO application ever submitted for an airport. In October 2019, the Planning Inspectorate, the independent body that examines such applications, recommended that the DCO should be refused. Their panel of 4 inspectors concluded that the case of need for a freight hub at Manston had not been adequately proven. The Secretary of State for Transport was advised to say no. In July 2020, Secretary of State Grant Shapps overruled the Planning Inspectorate and granted the DCO anyway. A resident of Ramsgate named Jenny Dawes, chairperson of the Ramsgate Coastal Community Team, launched a judicial review. She crowdfunded £85,268 from the public to fund her legal team. In December 2020, Grant Shapps's own department conceded the case. The approval letter, the Treasury solicitor acknowledged, had not contained adequate reasons for why the Secretary of State had disagreed with the Planning Inspectorate's finding on the question of need. The DCO was formally quashed in February 2021. A new determination was required. An independent report commissioned by the Secretary of State, carried out by Overup and Partners, concluded in October 2021 that the case of need for a freight hub at Manston had still not been proven. In August 2022, Transport Minister Carl McCarthy granted the DCO for a second time. Jenny Dawes launched a second judicial review. She crowdfunded a further £75,000. In January 2023, that second challenge was dismissed on the papers. In September 2023, after a full hearing at which barristers argued over whether the government had properly assessed both the need for the airport and its impact on the UK's carbon reduction targets, the second challenge was also definitively dismissed. Manston Airport finally had its planning consent. Again. Still, the human cost of the closure, 144 jobs in May 2014, was relatively modest compared to other airport disasters. But the damage to East Kent's economy was structural. The promise of growth dangled repeatedly over 25 years never materialized. The airport served as a deterrent to employers who did not want to set up near an active runway, but could not count on it closing either. Ramsgate, an attractive coastal town with genuine tourism potential, spent a quarter century in the shadow of an argument about flight paths and freight containers. By October 2024, River Oaks' Tony Freudman acknowledged publicly that the original development cost estimate of £400 million had risen to £650 million. By 2026, figures of £750 million were being cited in the press. As of June 2026, no airlines had confirmed any interest in operating from Manston. The airport remained closed. Work had not begun. Chapter 6. Who won, who lost, and the pattern that never changes. A. The lesson that wasn't learned. The story of Manston is not unique. It follows a pattern that repeats, with minor variations across British regional aviation. The reason the pattern repeats is partly structural. Regional airports in a country this small, this well connected by motorway and railway, face genuinely brutal competition from a small number of dominant hubs. But it is also political. Airports generate passion. They are visible infrastructure. They represent modernity, connectivity, economic aspiration. The MP for Thanet North has fought for Manston through 4 owners and 30 years. Local campaign groups have raised hundreds of thousands of pounds in crowdfunding, both to reopen it and to prevent it reopening, depending on which side you ask. The argument about Manston is not at its core a commercial argument. It is an argument about what kind of place East Kent wants to be. B. The interest behind the scenes. Who benefited from Manston's closure? The answer is straightforward. Gatwick, Stansted, and Heathrow benefited from the absence of a competing southeast freight facility. Every ton of air cargo that might have moved through Manston moved through an existing facility instead, consolidating the market power of the established players. London Southend gained ground as the preferred option for budget carriers seeking a less congested southeast base without the competitive noise of a Kent rival. And the property developers who held the Stonehill Park plans stood to gain considerably from conversion of 700 acres of prime Kent land to residential and commercial use, had the planning battles gone differently. The £1 sale price. Infratal giving Manston to Anglag for less than a bag of chips was not generosity. It was Infratal offloading a liability while retaining what they could from the transaction. Gloag's swift move to closure and her rejection of offers that would have left her in profit has never been fully explained to public satisfaction. The Unite Union called it bizarre. The local MPs called it extraordinary. Gloag herself said the losses made closure unavoidable, but the parliamentary record shows that offers existed which might have changed that outcome. C. The question the regulator never answered. Here is the question that has never received a clear answer in any public document. If the Planning Inspectorate, the body specifically constituted to assess the evidence for major infrastructure projects, twice concluded that the case of need for a Manston freight hub had not been proven, on what evidentiary basis did 2 successive Secretaries of State override that conclusion? The first decision was explicitly conceded by the government to have been inadequately reasoned. The second decision survived legal challenge but only narrowly. If expert evidence can be set aside by ministerial preference without adequate public explanation, then the planning process is not a process at all. It is theatre. D. The present as a mirror. In June 2026, Manston Airport remains closed. River Oaks Strategic Partners says it is in final discussions with a European funding partner. The target opening date for cargo operations is now 2029, 15 years after the last KLM flight departed for Amsterdam. No airlines have confirmed interest. The cost estimate has doubled since the original application. The runway is still there. The weeds are still growing. But the history of Manston is a history of plans that looked coherent on paper and disintegrated on contact with reality. The optimists have been wrong before. They have been wrong consistently, expensively, and without apparent consequence. So, the answer to the question posed at the beginning, how did London, how did Britain manage to waste £400 million on an airport nobody wanted? The answer is that nobody wasted £400 million. Not yet. £400 million is what River Oak originally said it would cost to develop Manston into a working freight hub, a figure that has since become £650 million, then £750 million, and which may well become more before a single concrete pour takes place, assuming one ever does. What has actually been wasted is harder to quantify but no less real. £100 million in cumulative losses across 16 years of private ownership that never produced a profit. Thousands of hours of parliamentary, legal and regulatory time spent arguing over planning consents that got granted, quashed, re-granted and challenged again. 25 years of economic uncertainty in one of the most economically deprived parts of the English coast. Who won? The established southeast airports. They faced no meaningful competition. The lawyers. They were kept very busy indeed. The crowdfunders on both sides. They proved that the British public will reach for their wallets to fight about a runway. Who lost? The 144 people who lost their jobs in May 2014. The 5,000 passengers stranded abroad in July 2005. The businesses in East Kent that were promised connectivity and received instead an argument. And perhaps most of all, Ramsgate, which spent 25 years as the reluctant neighbor of someone else's unfinished ambition. The synthesis, the single sentence that captures this entire saga, is perhaps this. In Britain, we are very good at deciding that things should happen, and very poor at deciding that they should not. Once a project acquires political momentum, institutional identity, and the vocabulary of optimism, it becomes almost impossible to kill cleanly. Manston should probably have been allowed to become something else entirely in 2015. The housing plans were controversial, but 25 years of airports has produced nothing but losses. The runway that saved 6,000 Allied aircraft in 1944 deserves better than to be a metaphor for institutional paralysis. For Nostalgic Britain, this has been your correspondent, signing off from a perfectly good runway that nobody can quite work out what to do with. On the bright side, at least the fox seems happy.